Hello, I'm Ira Lovich, and I am your host, your facilitator for Macroeconomics from Turion University. Welcome, students, to Macroeconomics, Video 16, International Trade. So what's our agenda for Video 16? We'll start out with both a review and a deeper dive into comparative advantage. Then some new topics that will relate to what we've discussed in prior videos, the two-worker production possibilities curve and the many-worker production possibilities curve. After that, we'll dig into consumption possibilities with international trade. After that, winners and losers of international trade. And we'll follow that with a discussion of trade restrictions, tariffs, quotas, and non-tariff barriers. We'll finish up the video with an analysis of the inefficiencies of trade barriers. Let's get started. We'll start out with our discussions, though, of international trade with what I'm going to call a fun fact. Many of you are probably owners of Apple iPhones, and maybe the rest of you are going to have some type of Android platform, which is represented in the market in the strongest sense by products from Samsung. So the question is your Apple iPhone an Apple iPhone or a Samsung iPhone? Strange question, you might think. Well, actually not. The iPhone, although it's recognized internationally as an Apple product, and it's desired in many parts of the planet for that reason. 26% of the component costs in it are made by the main rival, Samsung. Yep. And so in international trade, these kinds of conflicts are not that unusual. They're common as each country specializes, or each company focuses and specializes on what it does best and trades for the rest. How does that work? Well, let's get into that right now. Remember absolute advantage and comparative advantage from our prior videos? Yes? Good. Well, absolute advantage, as hopefully you recall, is when a country or perhaps a company only produces when costs are lower. That's because fewer resources will be used compared to others. It is more efficient than the alternative, and therefore you're going to have a beneficial amount of trade due to specialization. These ideas originated, of course, with Adam Smith in his Wealth of Nations in 1776. But you might also recall David Ricardo, who about 40 years later came up with comparative advantage as an alternative that was better. It was better because a nation can actually produce when the costs are lower in terms of other goods. This is a concept called opportunity cost. Even if a nation or a company has an absolute advantage in one commodity or one area or another, they still need to select the best alternative, even if they have several. In other words, although absolute advantage is more efficient, comparative advantage is the most efficient solution. Let's continue with this theme. So here's our old friend Michael Jordan. Remember the comparison between Michael Jordan and Gordon Ramsay? He has an absolute advantage, Michael Jordan does, for certain, in basketball. But remember, we compared that to an absolute advantage in cooking. Even if Michael Jordan is an amazing basketball player, which we know he certainly has been, but also a tremendous chef, it's still better for Michael Jordan, remember, to hire a chef than give up his basketball work. Do you remember why? Yes, the answer why Michael Jordan might still want to hire a chef rather than give up his basketball work, even if he has an absolute advantage in both basketball and cooking, is something called opportunity cost. Remember? There's our old friend David Ricardo from video 3. And as I'm hoping you recall, comparative advantage was developed by Mr. Ricardo. It can be applied to both individuals, as we discussed, and firms. And in the context of macroeconomics, we're going to think of it as it relates to nations, countries. And the idea behind it is to help determine what to produce and sell in comparison to other products. It's going to be influenced by the economic behavior of other nations, as well as where those nations might have a comparative advantage when it comes to one item, one commodity, one product or service or another. So in video 3, hopefully you remember that we actually used a comparison that was suggested originally to explain comparative advantage. We applied it using a comparison between the two nations of England and Portugal and two products, cloth and wine. And both could be produced by either nation. As a matter of fact, at this time, and perhaps as of today, I don't know what the wine production in England might be, but definitely those two items were produced or could have been produced at the time this example was used to demonstrate how comparative advantage works. And the comparison used the hours of work necessary to produce 1 unit of cloth and 1 unit of wine. It's not really important whether that's an ounce or a pound or a kilogram. What's important is that we're just comparing apples to apples, as I'm sure you've heard. So remember, two countries, England and Portugal, two items, two commodities, cloth and wine, right? England was able to produce 100 units of cloth for the same hours of work that they could produce wine. It would take 120 hours. So more hours of work to produce wine in England than cloth. What about Portugal? For Portugal to produce cloth was 90 hours of work, but to produce wine, only 80 hours of work. Are you following me so far? Cool. So as you might remember, this example was showing you the production possibilities, what could be produced. We call it the production possibilities frontier or curve, PPF for short, and we used healthcare and education, comparing again what could be spent in an economy on either or both. All the money on healthcare, point A, all the money on education, point F, and some balance in between. And most societies, of course, are not going to spend all of their resources in one area or another. Although depending upon circumstances, for example, a tough economy or international conflicts, a world war, where you might want to check into historically how an economy like the U.S., for example, suddenly marshaled all its resources during the Second World War, and pretty much all of the resources, the majority of them, went to defense and very little went to consumer products. In fact, there were shortages in consumer products because of that. But that's an extreme case. But every society has to find a balance between what would be socially optimal for those people. Now, we're only using two factors. We're only using two elements. We normally do that in the basics of macroeconomics or micro as well. Although, of course, every society, every nation has much more than two to consider. It's not just healthcare or education. There's many potential priorities. We're just using this again because it makes the learning experience easier. So in this case, there's a limitation of choice. In other words, this This is a maximum. The maximum is shown on the PPF. There's no way that individual society can offer more healthcare or education or some points on the curve than it does, because that's the production possibilities frontier. It's the border. Spanish speakers might recognize the word frontera for border in Spanish. So that's what we mean here. It's the upper limit of what that society can produce. So remember, the society cannot go beyond that curve, and that's why they would be using comparative advantage in this case to choose what to provide in that society. Another example that you might recall was using two nations, the United States and Saudi Arabia, and demonstrating before and after trade what would be the total available for those nations. And we use these two products, you might remember, oil and corn. We use them because they are both produced by both nations. But again, the question is, should Saudi Arabia concentrate on oil or corn, or how would they allocate their resources between the two? And the same applies to the United States. Again, we're only using two products for the learning experience. We, of course, know that every nation, I think almost every nation, maybe there is one that only produces one product, but that would be rare. But every nation has a multitude of products that it might be choosing from. We're just using two variables, two examples for the learning experience. So oil and corn, both produced in the US and Saudi Arabia, but the comparison we're trying to understand is where should each nation focus its attention, and if it does, will it be beneficial? So here are the statistics that we used in that example. And again, the point is to compare before and after trade, and to determine, is this knowledge that we're working through today, comparative advantage, does it truly inform us that there is a benefit to specialization and a benefit to trade, rather than a nation attempting to do all things and not trading for the rest? So here's Saudi Arabia. We have this example where they can produce 100 barrels of oil at maximum and 0 corn, or 25 bushels of corn. A bushel is a measurement, like a barrel of oil. A bushel is a measurement for an amount of agricultural produce. 25 bushels of corn and 0 oil, similar to education and healthcare in our prior example. Of course, it could also produce, similar to education and healthcare, many other combinations if they wanted to consume both goods. These are the extremes. All points above the frontiers are impossible to produce given the current level of resources and technology. That's the border. That's the frontier. That's what we keep talking about with the PPF. And these charts there were charts from week 2 that we used to explain this. So we're going to review them here, but also if you wanted to get more depth on the topic, please go back to the second video, week 2. The first video is the week 1. The second video we're calling week 2. So go to video 2 if you'd like a little more detail on what we're reviewing here. So here are the stats before trade for both nations, the US and Saudi Arabia. And you'll notice there is a PPF, a production possibilities frontier, for each, depending upon the capabilities, the resources that are in each nation. And you might also remember we talked about the factors of production: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. And so there's going to be allocations of these that will be different in each nation. We're not going to dig into right now The reasons for that, we've discussed some of them in prior videos, but we're just going to know that there are different possibilities in each of these two nations for a variety of factors. In other words, you can notice the maximum amount of oil and the maximum amount of corn that Saudi Arabia is capable of. That's going to be points A and B, and the maximum amounts for the United States, also points A and points B. The scales are somewhat different because, as you can tell so far, even without a big analysis, it does appear that Saudi Arabia has a comparative advantage in oil, and the United States has a comparative advantage in corn, because you can see that the scale is much larger for corn for the US, and the scale is much larger, the vertical scale for oil for Saudi Arabia. And again, each nation can produce not only on the extremes, but point C for each nation would be a balance. So point C for Saudi Arabia would be more oil, less corn. United States, more corn, less oil. But the point is that there is a balance being shown on point C between both the two commodities. Hopefully that's clear. The important concept here that I'm reiterating is that all points outside the frontiers, outside the border, are impossible given the current resources. So without trade, each nation has a limitation based upon their own factors of production. Without trade, there's a choice between so much corn and so much oil in this example, but there is no choice to have more corn or more oil. The maximum at either extreme is all that nation is capable of producing based upon the current situation. So there's nothing more that can be done, if that makes sense. So what is the maximum oil for Saudi Arabia? In this case, 100 barrels. What is the maximum corn? 25 bushels. What is the maximum? Oh, and point C, again, is that blend in between, because Saudi Arabia's citizens might want to drive and eat, let us say. And the same thing for the United States. What is the maximum for the United States when it comes to oil? 50 barrels. What is the maximum when it comes to corn? 100 bushels, point B. And again, let's assume people in the United States, since we're not trading, the people in the United States want to drive, they need oil, and they also want to eat, they need corn. And therefore, there's point C, which is maybe the happy medium based upon what are the needs of that society, what would be considered socially optimal in that society to provide for the people that live there. As we've shown before, this chart can be really helpful to understand this concept of opportunity cost, and we can calculate it, and that's really important, and that's why we're using this chart again. The PPF illustrates the opportunity cost, because we're not only seeing the maximums or the combinations of possible goods by using the production possibilities frontier, it's also demonstrating what the cost in oil is for Saudi Arabia to shift to more corn and vice versa, and what the cost of corn is for the United States to shift to more oil. We're assuming again that people want to drive in both societies and they want to eat. And since there's no trade going on, the only option to provide both energy and food is for that society to have a balance of both, some balance. But it doesn't mean it's an equal balance, because the opportunity cost for Saudi Arabia is going to be much greater to produce corn, and the opportunity cost for the United States is going to be much greater to shift to oil, because the U.S. has a comparative advantage in this example for production of corn, and Saudi Arabia has a comparative advantage for production of oil. So I would suggest, as I said earlier, going back to the second video, as well as repeating in this particular section and rewinding it, because it's really important to understand this concept as we discuss trade among nations throughout this video. So as I mentioned, this topic of comparative advantage is really important for understanding international trade, and it's also difficult often for students because opportunity cost is not a concept, it's not a type of analysis that is in normal society. We use accounting cost, money cost, but remember here we're counting everything, even time. We're counting the trade-off between one option or choice and another, and of course there's many more choices than two choices. This is just for our example. So again, Saudi Arabia gives up the least amount of corn to produce oil. It has a comparative advantage of oil. The United States gives up the least in terms of oil to produce a bushel of corn because it has a comparative advantage in corn production. So this is informing us now, this is teaching us that there's an advantage after trade. If the United States was to focus or concentrate more on corn, and Saudi Arabia was to focus and concentrate more on oil, there's a benefit to both nations. And of course, we're just talking about two items and two nations. But that's the point of this example, to demonstrate on a small scale. And of course, actually, international trade is happening on a large scale. On a small scale, why it's advantageous to nations to pick the items, even if they have both items or many items or thousands of items, to be focusing on those items, concentrating on the items that have the lowest opportunity cost. Sometimes this graph is also helpful because we've added a point we did not have before on the other graph. Why did we add the point? Because for Saudi Arabia, for example, or for the United States, either one, they had a limitation, a frontier, a border of what could be produced without trade. And remember, there was A, in this case for Saudi Arabia, 100 barrels of oil, or B, 25 bushels of corn, or some allocation, some distribution in between, which was represented by point C, right? C was the happy medium, I suppose, for what would be considered socially optimal, some driving, some eating, some nutrition. But here we've added point D. Where did point D come from? Because now with trade, it's possible for Saudi Arabia to increase their consumption of corn. They can focus more on oil and trade the oil and actually be better able to feed their population. Their corn consumption has increased from 25 bushels, from 25 bushels to 30 bushels because they're now able to trade the oil for corn. And because they get a bigger bang for their buck, as you might have heard that expression, they get more benefit from trading. Suddenly there's the opportunity to feed the people with more corn than there was if Saudi Arabia was only using their own productive capabilities. What's the gain from trade? The gain from trade in this example is Saudi Arabia can consume more than it can produce as a result of specializing in oil and trading for corn. So here's our old friend Adam Smith in the image, and he was one of the first to identify, he's sort of considered the father of modern market economics. He identified the gains from specialization. And rather than one worker, in his example, working by themselves, making this one item. It happened to be pins, and they could make approximately 20 pins per day, working on their own, doing all the tasks, all the functions necessary to create a pin. Each worker, instead of making one pin in his example, would specialize and concentrate on one of approximately 18 different tasks that were necessary to make a pin. And by the workers specializing and each one doing approximately one of those 18 tasks and getting good at it because they did it over and over again, 10 workers could make 48,000 pins per day. And that's instead of 20 pins a day, that's 240 times greater productivity if you divide by 10 workers. Because instead of 20 pins, each worker is making 480 pins per day. And so that's a huge gain in productivity, isn't it? And that leads us to the topic of the two-worker production possibilities curve. And again, we're using these examples to understand and actually to justify, to quantify why trade, especially trade between nations, is ultimately beneficial. So every worker, of course, has strengths and weaknesses, as do nations, right? And this could be due to natural circumstances, an absolute advantage for nations or people, geographic luck, the geographic luck for a person of being born in a highly productive society that offered more opportunities rather than a society with limited options for a variety of reasons. And of course, there's also something we talked about with Mr. Jordan, pictured again there below me, is that there's also hard work, there's dedication. And maybe Mr. Jordan, I'm sure, as we've discussed before, practiced a lot to develop his talent into being so awesome. And so there's something that you folks are doing here in this class, learning, which also can enhance somebody's advantages. So each worker or nation should exploit, and we mean that in a good way, should exploit or take full advantage of their comparative advantage. That's the idea. Each individual, just like each nation, needs to figure out where they get the most benefit for the least amount of time and resources, and time and other resources, and that is where they would get their comparative advantage. Let's review this video to help underscore this concept. Let's discuss the two-worker production possibilities curve. Martha and Gordon want to host a dinner party together. Martha cuts 2 ounces of veggies per minute, or makes 1 ounce of appetizers per minute. What about Gordon? He makes 2 ounces of appetizers in 1 minute. Let's just say Gordon is not as talented with a knife as Martha and only cuts 1 ounce of veggies in a minute. Martha's production possibilities frontier provides either 120 ounces of veggies in an hour or only 60 ounces of appetizers. Gordon's production possibilities frontier per hour is 120 ounces of appetizers, but only 60 ounces of veggies. If Martha and Gordon merge their production possibilities frontiers together, the maximum productivity is 180 ounces of either veggies or appetizers. But if Martha and Gordon work together, specializing in what they do best, they can produce 240 ounces of veggies and appetizers for the party. Martha does the veggies. Because Martha has a comparative advantage, cutting vegetables. Gordon does the appetizers. Because Gordon has a comparative advantage here. Two workers specializing in what they do best yields more. Let's party! What's the verdict?
Way to go, Martha and Gordon.
And that's a brief explanation of the two-worker production possibilities curve. Hopefully that helped. What is the many-worker production possibilities curve then? If we go beyond two workers, well, it's essentially a PPC, or production possibilities curve, that's best represented in society by GDP, or total productivity. Remember trade-offs? So at full employment, remember the Keynesian concept of full employment does not mean zero unemployment. It means a rate of between normally 2 to 6%, somewhere in that range, perhaps 4 to 5%. And so at full employment, workers must be redeployed from one industry to the other. In other words, if we're talking about corn and oil, can you imagine somebody moving from the agricultural process to the process of exploring and producing oil? Two very different skill sets. So at full employment, it can be challenging to move workers. They might not want to move. They might not have the capability to move, at least without a lot of training, education, and time. So there's a finite or fixed production possibilities curve, and GDP represents that the best. This means that workers would need to be moved, as we said, from one area to the other when there's full employment. And so the many worker production possibilities curve is showing how it's a challenge to switch people at full employment from one industry or producing one commodity or good to the other. So as we have demonstrated with this chart, with Saudi Arabia producing both corn and oil, by specializing in oil, the consumption possibilities increase for their people. Their people would have the ability or the option to have more agricultural produce represented by corn. So instead of trying to feed the population, and instead of trying to provide all the energy for the population, Saudi Arabia concentrates on oil and then is able to trade the oil and ends up with a far greater amount of corn. So the gains from trade are showing that global consumers overall, at least in this example, have more possibilities. In this case, more corn or more food to eat by not trying to produce the food and the energy to satisfy the needs of that society, of that nation. So this example demonstrated that. We pushed out the PPF. We increased the ability for the people in Saudi Arabia to consume corn, or in this case, representing the ability to have more food. So in the aggregate, this example demonstrates that global consumers can get more variety, but there is a little bit of a catch. A catch? How could there be something negative from something so positive? As we've seen, by trading, Saudi Arabian citizens are now able to consume more corn than they did before. So how could this be a negative? Well, it might not be a negative for them, but the question is international trade a negative for somebody? So I know you figured I wouldn't have asked the question, of course, if there wasn't something behind it. And the winners and losers of international trade do exist. Yes, there's a winner. In the case of the prior example, the people of Saudi Arabia were able to consume more food, more corn. But the U.S. International Trade Commission have done a study on it. And what did they say? Well, they predicted that overall, there would not be a big loss of jobs from increasing international trade. But that doesn't mean that everybody benefits. Obviously, if there's not a large overall loss, there's some loss. And the question is, who's the one that's losing their job? Because to that person, it's a negative. They're a loser. To somebody else, they might be a winner. And there is no way that any economist can present where there'll always be a winner and a loser. There's no way that everybody wins. There's no way everybody loses, too. And so the question is, who's going to win and who's going to lose? And so to be efficient, well, the efficiency means that there's more winners than there are losers. And that is probably going to be the case. But globally, there's going to be some losers. And again, if you're one of those losers, or your family are one of those losers, or your industry is struggling because of international trade, it's not a positive thing for you. So yes, globally, international trade means much more variety. As we noticed in the example with Saudi Arabia, more corn, more food. But it's inefficient, unfortunately. As I mentioned, not everybody is a winner. It's unfortunate that for some people, they are going to be the losers. And for those people, well, it's not efficient. And that takes us, class, to the subject of barriers. Barriers to trade. And the number one way to think about barriers would be something that is put up like a fence to protect the jobs or the industries in the home nation. That's also known as, AKA, protectionism. And protectionism takes three main forms. The first, tariffs. Tariffs are similar to taxes on trade. Then quotas. A quota would be a limitation on some item, like here automobiles or appliances. And then the one that is perhaps most difficult to understand because it's not always obvious would be non-tariff barriers that are used to slow down or stop the import of certain items into a nation. So let's break these down one by one, and hopefully they'll be more understandable after we do that. So the first of the protection methods is called tariffs. This is perhaps the most visible one and the one that students might hear about or learn about from listening to or reading the news. And it's a tax essentially on imported goods. And it varies from nation to nation. Here's a chart from the World Bank that uses a color-coded system to show the percentage value of tariffs around the world. And you can go to the World Bank's 2020 tariff rate data. I think that's the latest that's been published. Just go to World Bank, wb.org, and you can, or do a web search on the World Bank. And they're the ones that have been compiling and producing most of this data that is used. And so the lowest, Brunei at 0.1%. The highest reported by the World Bank is Bermuda at slightly over 24%. For a point of comparison, China's average tariffs are 2.5%, and the USA's average is 1.5%. But these are averages, and it depends actually if you go to the United States trade information that I had quoted earlier. If you go to the U.S. trade and look it up, you're going to find it varies considerably, not just by item, but for example, there's a search criteria to locate the code for what it is that is produced. And if, let's say, you were to look for shirts, you would find out it's not just importing shirts, but are they cotton? Are they polyester? Are they a cotton polyester blend? It's very granular, too much for this particular video or even this introductory course to macroeconomics. But I did want to mention that the U.S. Trade website has a very, very specific way of looking up what the tariffs are. So even though we see 1.5% on the slide, that is an average for all goods across the board. That means for some there might be 0 because they're considered essential and they're not in conflict with any industries in the United States, and some might be considered in conflict and might be a risk to jobs in the United States or industries, and therefore that tariff could be much larger. So this is an average. It varies very specifically by what the item is, and that's the same for pretty much all nations. If you wanted to really investigate it, I invite you to do that. But again, for this introductory class and this section, let's just discuss this at a high level, if you don't mind. So we mentioned quotas was the second form of protectionism, and it's a numerical limitation on the quantity of products that a country can import. Now, sometimes they are voluntary. Sometimes nations will impose quotas upon themselves to prevent a nation imposing it upon them that they're trying to import into. But if they're violated, whether they're voluntary or involuntary, which is involuntary means set by the importing nation, which is most common, there could be a tariff rate assessment or tax. It's called TRQs or tariff rate quotas, or an assessment or a penalty for an out of quota amount of imports that go into a nation, and that sort of turns it back into a tariff. But essentially, a tariff is a percentage, like a tax, on what is brought in, and a quota is a limitation on what a nation is allowed to bring in specific categories. Actually, as I mentioned, NTBs, non-tariff barriers, are perhaps the most complicated. Sometimes they are hidden. In fact, often they are, because they are not something certainly that the regular public is going to be knowledgeable about. And because there's so many forms of them, they can be difficult to assess. We're going to give a list, actually, provide a list of all the different types, but we're not going to dig into them at a very, very deep level. So there are essentially rules, restrictions, inspections, different types of paperwork, anything that might make it more costly or even difficult to import products. An example might be a rule that requires certain safety standards or origin regulations that might not even allow certain items from certain countries because that's an item or a commodity that country is producing heavily, and they don't want any competition coming in from an outside company from another nation. And so the NTBs, as I mentioned, can be very complicated. There's many different forms. Some of them are more obvious, some of them are more hidden, and often they're controversial, like one I'll mention in just a moment called subsidies. And so the data for NTBs mostly comes from the World Bank. So let's examine that in a little bit more detail. So here's that long list I probably scared you with, and maybe it is scary. We're not going to examine each individual item. We won't analyze them one by one. There's no following slides. It's too much. Don't worry, class. But I did want to produce this list courtesy of the World Bank and heritage.org so that we can get an idea of how many different possibilities there are for NTBs. The normal ones that might relate to quotas, but also an embargo, which says nothing from that country or that particular item from that country is not allowed, and that could be for political as well as economic reasons. Counter trade, which indicates that the only way to import into our country is if you let a company from our country export into your country. Anti-dumping. Dumping is a complicated rule. Well, maybe not that complicated, but it indicates that a country or a company in that country is not allowed to sell products artificially at low prices, lower than they might even be sold in their own nation. Regulatory restrictions, licensing in order to bring something in, or regulations, as we talked about, on the types of items maybe that would give a safety, for example, a safety regulation that might be or something that relates to intellectual property, such as trademarks or patents. Investments restrictions, producing financial records can be burdensome. Basic customs restrictions that slow down the import of items, or even that classification I mentioned to you earlier. It's not just a shirt, but what's the composition? Is it cotton? Is it polyester? Is it a cotton poly blend? These types of restrictions make it more difficult for imports to happen. And then direct government intervention, the one that is perhaps the most controversial, is subsidies, where, let's say, maybe the number one example that you can look up in the news that has a lot of controversy is between Boeing and Airbus, the two largest manufacturers of commercial aircraft. And Airbus, perhaps, which has ownership from a corporation that is connected to two nations, England and France. Could they use taxes to subsidize or reduce the cost to Airbus so Airbus can sell their jets for less? Or Boeing moving across the country from one state to the other, and that state perhaps providing tax incentives to move there, lowering Boeing's cost, and then Boeing again can sell their jets for less. So subsidies are quite complicated, and they could relate both to nations or even states or cities that offer incentives to a particular company to locate there, and then the consequences would be perhaps lowering the cost, which means the company can even lower their price, and that might be considered NTBs as well. Any kind of complicated regulatory paperwork or qualifications fits into this particular category. So as I said, we're not analyzing them one by one, don't want to scare you, but did want to provide the list. And if students are interested, or they might hear about something in the news, perhaps subsidies, as I mentioned, the conflict between Boeing and Airbus is something that does hit the news on a sort of a regular basis. It'll give the students some background as to what's going on there. You'll be happy to know, students, we're winding down our video with our final topic, the inefficiencies of trade barriers. So there's likely a consensus among economists and political leaders as well that trade barriers, such as the ones we just talked about, tariffs, quotas, and NTBs, are inefficient. They're inefficient on a global scale. In other words, they tend to raise consumer and producer prices around the planet. And they even tend to raise them in most nations. Who are the victims of trade barriers? Well, almost all the time they're going to be consumers, because by raising the price in the importing country, it of course will raise the price for the consumer to buy that commodity or that item. Who are the beneficiaries? Who gets something out of a trade barrier? Well, employees, management, and owners at any specific industry that's been protected. And you'll notice here in this slide, there's a graphic from the OECD, and it is indicating overall what the barriers to foreign direct investment, what tariff barriers have been, and how they might have fallen. As you can see, the red is the most recent data. And overall, barriers to trade have been falling since 1988. So the barriers have been falling. This is World Bank data and OECD, as well as the IMF, International Monetary Fund. So even though there's a consensus, meaning a general agreement that trade barriers are inefficient, there's still pressure. The pressure is to protect domestic industries and jobs. If consumers pay more in a protected industry, of course, there's less to spend elsewhere. So again, globally, even nationally, it can be computed, as you can notice in the productivity gains from reducing tariff barriers in this particular chart, that overall reducing barriers to trade is good for the planet overall and for most nations overall. But what can protectionism accomplish? It can save jobs in specific industries. And those industries are grateful, and they're putting pressure on their governments to protect their jobs. But of course, it can also cost jobs in other industries. So here's a final example about the inefficiencies of trade barriers. It's the tariff on imported TVs, televisions. Domestic producers, of course, are helped because the higher price makes consumers reluctant to buy the imported goods and more likely to buy the domestic produced televisions. The price is up for domestic consumers, so domestic producers are helped. The higher prices and lower quantities are going to be consumed, though, overall, because of the higher price. But then there's something called the deadweight loss that's identified in this graphic. And that's the yellow areas which are B and D. Because the price has gone up, there's a deadweight loss, which means in the aggregate it's inefficient because consumers are paying more for TVs and they have less to buy other items in the society. So who is helped? The domestic TV producers. Who is hurt? The foreign TV producers, of course, as well as the consumers that want to buy televisions. So the effects of the tariff certainly are inefficient. Trade barriers in the aggregate are inefficient. But in individualized cases, of course, they help, and that's why they persist. Congratulations, class. We've made it to the end of video 16. International trade. Great work. Now it's time to move on to our final video on exchange rates. And I just wanted to give you my sincere compliments for your progress to date. There's one more video, so let's move on to that and complete our course.